So I'm going to build this up and a little bit. And you see how now we can get this really beautiful range of color because we can merge some. There I can sort of put an end here. And remember, if you are using other materials, like for example you are painting your roses with oils, the end result will be very different, and the techniques that you would need to employ will be very different too. Hey, I'm Leila. Welcome back to my channel. You guys have asked me so many times to increase the amount of the extra relaxing ASMR-ish kind of videos that you'd like me to make. So I listen, and here's another one. Today we will draw roses on black paper. We will use water mixable pastels. It's going to be a very relaxing, very calm video. So I hope you get to learn, relax and enjoy. Always I will start with pencil sketching. What I would like to do first is I'd like to mark the areas where my flowers are going to be and the direction they're going to be pointing towards. So this one is going to point this way and this one is going to go upwards. Okay, so first I'll start working on this one. I'm not going to do everything in a lot of detail, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the main shape of this. I guess it's in between of being a flower bud and full open flower. So I'm just going to mark a couple of major lines through. There's another petal there, another petal there, and green stem. I'm going to work on this one now, and again I'm going for the main shape here first. Just marking some of these things through. I might change my mind a little bit on where some of the things are going to go once I start to work with color, so that's why I'm not going to spend too much time sketching this. So for those of you who are following along, you can look at your own images and sort of follow similar steps, but according to whatever you are looking at. So you might have a different kind of a rose or something entirely different. Okay, so now that I have marked all the lines in pencil, I can move on to my color. Now with water mixable pastels, it's kind of like working with very intense watercolor, but because we are working on black paper, one thing that we have to remember is that all the colors sort of work in reverse. Or rather than putting on the shadows, we're actually applying on the lights, because the shadows are already there. Your darkest shadow is already represented on the black paper. Okay, so what I've done is I've actually moved my board a little bit upwards, so that way I think it'll be easier to see what I'm doing. And also what I'm going to do now is I'm going to soften the pencil lines a little bit, because this is just a normal natural pencil, not a watercolor pencil. I would like to get rid of some of the lines that I'm not going to need that I've used for my construction. By the way, I have a video which I'm going to link in the corner there, which actually talks about how to structure all different objects in an easy way. Now I am going to soften all of these lines, so that if they do come through, it's not as obvious, as I'm planning to make really light colored roses. Some of these I don't really need. Okay, a little bit here and a little bit there. That's the beauty of using putty rubber. It removes graphite without completely erasing it. So I can just remove some of it for some lines to still be visible. So because this is black paper, we already have all of our shadows built into the work, and everything that I'm going to be applying would be mid shadows and soft lights and really bright highlights. So anything that's lighter than black, I'm going to have to apply onto the paper. Anything that's black or dark, I can pretty much just leave it black paper. Okay, so I'm going to start softly working on the flowers, and then I'll move on to the stems as well. So because this flower is going to be white with just a little bit of pink and green going through it, and this one's going to be a little bit more pink, I'm going to start a little bit differently as well. For this flower, I'm going to mix these two colors to start with, and I'm only going to go over the areas that are lighter than black paper. So I'm not going full strength on this now, because you can always add a stronger layer, but you cannot remove once you've applied it on. Well, you can soften it, but it's quite hard to do that. I'm going to go over some areas again. So at the moment it looks a little bit like a blob, but the more we work on it, the better it will shape itself. And now I'm going to go for more of a stronger pink and add a little bit of the lighter, because even though it's a pink rose, it's still going to be quite a soft pink. Okay, so far you can tell me, but how come this is not painting, this is drawing? And that's the cool thing about water mixable pastels, is that you can draw and paint at the same time. So what I'm doing now is I am just removing most of the water from the brush, and really with just a brush that's just slightly damp, I'm going to soften some of these lines, and then I'm going to leave this area to dry so that I can move on to this one here. And so what the water does is it helps us to sort of not only smooth the actual drawing marks, but also it helps us to soften the color a little bit. And you can build up just a little bit more. The reason why I don't want to use too much water is because I don't want to wait for this for too long to dry. That's why my brush is sort of a semi-moist, semi-dry. But if you've got lots of time to wait for things to dry, you can use a really wet brush. Just remember that you need to make sure that your paper suits handling some water. This is not watercolor paper. I still can't find black watercolor paper, but it's reasonably thick. It's like a card sort of a thickness. Okay, so now I'm going to leave this to dry. And I'm going to move on to this flower. Okay, now with this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to really softly go over it with white. Now, in a very similar way that I did here, but I'm going to just barely touch the paper, and then when I use water, it sort of is going to wash it out a little bit. Okay, but I still want to go in within the, within the shape of the flower. I'm not just blocking. I'm not just color blocking. I'm still working within the petals of the rose. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce a little bit of soft pink. I think it's called salmon color, this one. And a little bit of pink. Also some yellow. And a little bit of light green. If you are enjoying this video, don't forget to check out my Patreon page, where I have recently posted a follow-along video that's completely narrated in Russian with English subtitles underneath. If this is something that you might be interested in, please check it out, and just for $8 a month you will be able to receive all the extra videos with tips, tricks and more relaxation. Okay, this is almost dry actually, which is good, but now I'm going to soften some of these colors here. So again, what I'm doing is I've got my brush that is somewhat damp, but you can see it doesn't have that much water, and now I'm going to softly go over the areas with that to, if it gets too dry, you can always go back in for some more water. Actually, this green part here belongs to that petal there, so merge it all together. This one belongs to this one here. You see how the brush takes that funny shape because it's only slightly damp. Some more here. I'll just soften all of this because we'll be able to add more definition later. I'm almost rubbing with a brush rather than painting with it, just because with these first layers I'm just trying to avoid applying too much water. Okay, so now I'm going to give this a good nice wash and go back to this flower. A little bit of white, and I'm going to mark some of the brighter little ridges that are catching the light. And there's a really bright one here, and this part here all through is catching a lot of light. So I'm going to build this up and a little bit through here. Now I'm going to add some more pink over the white. What this will do is it'll just make the color so much more intense. Also, if you look at rose petals, they kind of have that sort of a pattern, those little veins that are going through, so we can put those in as well. And I'm also going to introduce a little bit more of the brighter pink, especially on the edges of the petal. And build up that color. So now I'm introducing this darker pink into the shadows. I'm not introducing it in a really dense manner because remember, we can use black of the paper as our shadows, but because the rose is still not black, okay, I think that's enough build up probably for us to go in and start using more moisture. So while this is all drying, we're gonna work on this again. Okay, so the same thing again. I don't want my brush to be too wet, but I want it to be damp so that it can dilute the watercolor pastels. And you see how now we can get this really beautiful range of color because we can merge some of these colors more, or we can keep them separate from each other, and you can create really interesting color combinations and variations. Put more water, smoothing this a little bit. So see here, I'm smoothing it softly, but I'm not completely dissolving these veins that I've created with my pastel marks. So the more layers we apply, the more we can carve the shape out. And what I'm going to do is that there are some areas that are actually quite dark, so I'm going to try and remove a little bit of the pastel to create just a bit more of the shadow. Again, if you were working on the white paper, it would be very different. You would actually be applying more shadow with color rather than removing it. Because when you work with white paper, you've got all the highlights you need, but with black paper, you've got all the shadows you need. Just soften it there. Okay, so now I'm going to leave this to dry, while I'm going to go back and do another layer on that rose. And for this rose, I'm going to go in again with some more white, and I'll add all the other colors in as well. Let's see, some really strong highlighted areas. I'll start with those. And then this. This was the shape of the leaf here, of the petal I mean, and then a little bit of the other one sticking out, and then a little bit more white on the side there. And these petals, they're mainly in shadow, but just a little bit on the bottom there, sketching some light. This part is really light as well, but we'll balance it out more with future layers as well. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce a little bit more pink. I'm just gonna go all throughout. And I'm going to go with some green. And I am going to introduce some, actually I'm going to go for some ochre rather than yellow, this light ochre. Because it will just help to merge that pink and the green together rather than the bright yellow. Okay, and now I'm going back for my brush. And I'm going to softly merge some of the marks left by the pastels. Now the reason why I like using water mixable pastels for some situations over watercolor is, like you can see here, traditional watercolor, you should not be really using white, and even if you do end up using white, you just use it to reapply some highlights that you've missed out on. But with pastels, you can build it up as thick as you want, and which is also a plus over watercolor pencils as well, and watercolor pencils will never give you such a rich color buildup of color. Say for example on something like black paper, and they would be really, really soft, very sort of a shaded pastel. So if you do like working with watercolor or watercolor pencils, but you feel that there's just not enough of just that depth, you can try using watercolor pastels. I also have an overview video for watercolor, like if you're starting up with watercolor and water mixable pastels and things like that, so make sure you check that video out. Some areas that are the color meant to be a little bit soft, I'm just going to almost dry brush. I better not get too carried away because you can damage the brush if you go too hard. Okay, I'm quite liking that softness and that blend of color that we're getting, and I'm gonna go over the areas that are shadows and just sort of remove a little bit more of the pastel, or blend it out a bit more. They're still not black paper because the flower is obviously so light, but you can definitely see the difference. Okay, so now both of these are on the same level, and what I'm going to do now is, yep, this is dry enough for me to go over and add some more details to it and some more things. And because they also have such a buttery feel, they can kind of blend into each other, even without water to some degree. And now also what I want to do is I want to, crisp up all the edges that I think should be nice and sharp. Like this one, for example, that little thin little petal. And this edge here too. See, just that little one there. Also add a bit more highlight over here, and this area here, I definitely need to highlight that too. And these, because the light is sort of falling like this, so it catches here and it catches here too. And now I'm going to go in with this color, the salmon pink. And what I'm doing now is I'm softening some of this black that's coming through, where it's coming through a little bit too harshly. And I'm also going to use more pink just to strengthen the color a little bit more. Okay, and now you can see how it's really getting, getting there. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use this small brush, because at this stage I really want to avoid really large sort of smudged areas. Also this flower is reasonably small, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just blend some of these. And another thing that you can do is you can use a little bit of pastel with the brush and then add a little bit of extra color, especially if it's something small. But that's just in some instances, you know, if you need a little touch up, or maybe like a highlight. I need a bit more water. And a few more veins. You can see how with watercolor pastels they really allow you to really build them up and work quite thick. If you need to. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this ink. Just going to pick up a little bit of paint. I can even get a little bit of black, and I don't really need to do this, but I just want to show you if you've got some areas maybe on your artwork where you need to just bring it back to the black. You can do the same thing, just pick up a little bit of black and add a little bit more definition, like in some areas, for example like this. Put more water. So ideally, of course, if you leave the black paper visible, but what happens is sometimes with these little areas, it's so easy to just go over them with your pastel. Because the areas are just so small. Probably you would have a different situation if you were working on a larger scale, so this little bud wasn't so little. So there, and also I am going to add some of this color on there, and just add a little bit of that warm silver pink. Put more water. This one's quite tough, so it doesn't want to soften a bit. And I'm also going to, where is it there, apply tiny little bit just to blend it in, just really softly on the side there, just a little. See, this is almost watercolor like, that sort of a brush movement. So same here, just a little bit there. It won't be as bright when it dries up. A little bit there. I'm gonna put some like veins, you know, if you look at the rose petals, you usually get such beautiful soft veins that are just tiny little bit lighter than the rest of the petal, or sometimes it can be bright. It just depends what petal, what rose, I guess. And I also want to just add a little bit more white. To highlight that sort of front petal as well. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing and move from this flower back onto this flower because it feels quite dry already. So let's have a look. Let's see if we can introduce some more white. So pretty much all the areas that are quite light, I'm going with white over them, just like I did before with previous layers. And now perhaps in the areas where I can bring more definition, I do so. Pink just a little bit over. And then as I'm going and defining more things, I will be adding more colors as I go. So with this one, I'm going to work with each petal separately. It's definitely not a really sort of a brushy, really quick technique. This is very tight, but that's the effect that I personally really like, that a water mixable pastel can create on black paper. Just want to create a bit more shadow here, so I'm going to go and then just remove I'm actually going to turn this over. Just to make it a little bit easier for me to handle it. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a very similar thing what I did here, and that's I'm going to go through all the little details and add the tiny little color variations and so on. Here, and I'm going to be adding some other shades in as well. Okay, some ochre this time, and a little bit more green into these bottom leaves, petals. Okay, now I'm going to soften these areas again, and I'm using the larger of the two brushes. So what I'm trying to do now here is to smooth these areas out, and then I'll be able to add more highlights and so on. Now I'm going to go back into the white, and now I'm going to use a small brush, pick it off as paint, and create more petals or petal definition. This technique would be useful for any other color as well, so not just white rose. The same would be for, say, a red rose or a yellow rose. You just need to make sure you're using light and darker colors according to, you know, the color of your chosen rose. And you know, some highlights on the petals, because that petal, for example, gets a shadow from being quite close to the other petals, and so some areas of it really catch the light. Now I'm going to leave this one to dry a little bit because I want to work a little bit more on this, but it's still a bit too wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back with watercolor pencils, and I'm going to use that for blending because this is all dry now. What I'm pretty much trying to achieve here is the really soft look. So rather than using these watercolor pencils for actually depositing any color, I'm actually using them for, you know, that final perfect, almost wax-like sort of a smudge. You know, especially with these perfect sort of crisp edges. That'll help. If I did the whole sketch with watercolor pencils, the look would have been very different, and I probably wouldn't have done it on the black paper either. So this is just for the finishing up. I also want to soften the outside. And the watercolor pencil gives you very different sound as well, for those of you who are watching it for ASMR reasons. It's quite different from your mixable pastel. So what I'm going to do now here is I'm going to too much water. That's not good. Okay, I'll just grab some more paint. Is that I'm going to just work on some really small, these tiny little swirled petals, and just create a few more layers, with addition of paint for showing extra highlights and things. There, I think it's really getting there, this flower. Okay, now let's see if this one, yep, this one's definitely much more dry now. So what I'm going to do now is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a little bit of pink with the brush. I'm not going to make the whole flower pink, but the center of it a little bit more pinky, and go for some more ochre and wash that in there. As well as in here and in here. And now I'm going to add more white. And work through the petals. So just building it up on the sides, and now I'm going to go over some lighter areas again. So these areas are dry now from previous paint application. So now I'm going to go back in with a little bit more green. And I'm also going to use my brush to pick up some black from the black pastel and add some shadows here and there. You know, some areas that I would want to go back to a little bit darker. Okay, here. And maybe also define some of the edges if I want them a little bit cleaner too. So just defining here and there. Some over here in the bottom. And you know what, if you don't want to get into all of the details, you don't really have to. You can just, you know, leave it a little bit sketchy as well, which can also be quite nice. You know, they're sort of emerging from that black background. Can be quite nice. You know, the torn little bits on the petals too. Okay, now to me it feels like I want to add just a tiny little bit of the orangey sort of shades going through here. You know how I've been using ochre instead of yellow, so now I want to go back and add a little bit more yellow, because roses quite often get that sort of a almost like a reflective yellow light going through. Not sure why, but quite often you'd see it, especially on light colored roses. Now I'm going full strength on some of these areas, so I'm just pressing quite hard to deposit as much of that white as I can, but only on the areas of the really strong highlight. Okay, what else? I have some up here too. And going back to the little bit of yellow. So for those of you, for example, if you're working on red roses, for instance, that might be orange rather than yellow, or maybe it can be like a really light blue, depending on the shade of your actual flower. I'm gonna go for a little bit of red, but warmer red in this instance. I just okay, so now I'm gonna try and do a very similar thing to what I did here in the end, and that's using water mixable pencils, just to give it that extra little bit of texture. As you can see, they don't deposit that much color compared to the pastels, but they also have their own pluses. Can help create beautiful texture. And good for little details, especially if you're not very good at using small brushes for creating the tiny little details. I'm going to do the same thing, but with white, so I'm going over white for that added texture. and to help create that really soft sort of blended look into the darkness of the black paper. I really love how petals sort of roll on the roses. But see, here I'm going on black paper with as much strength that I can put into working with the pencil, and you can see the difference between what I can get with this and what I can get with the pastel. Just a little bit of that extra green that I wanted to. And now I'm going to go in for a little bit more definition in the center there. I'm not going to go too much. And to be honest, I don't really want to define all of them, otherwise it will look very outlined. And now I'm gonna go back in with a little bit of water and merge some of these colors. I'm gonna go in with a little bit of green. And there are just a few leaves that I can sort of put in. Okay, so now that I've marked those down with this green, I'm going to go in with a darker green. And same here. I'm not going to do too much detail on these. But I do think that, you know, it's good for that sort of a rose-like feel. Now I'm going to use ochre as well here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create highlights, but rather than using white, because what white will do, I'll just give you a little demonstration. What white would do is it will give you a really sort of a cool shade. At first I want to go in with a warmer color, and then we can put some of brighter highlights once we're, you know, once we're happy with what we've got. Some more here. And here. And you know, if you pay attention, you will actually notice that when roses are really dark, deep red, you would get a lot of red in the green leaves as well. Like lots of little veins that are going to be just sort of burgundy. And with even with these ones, you get, sometimes you can get quite a bit of brown coming through as well. But some especially smaller, sort of roses, they usually get just a really green, just your usual sort of color. Now I'm gonna use some water, just like we did with the flowers themselves. I'm not even doing it all throughout, I'm just doing a little bit of it. Okay, now I'm gonna go in for some brown. And I'm going to use watercolor pencils. And I'm not only using it for depositing color, but I'm also using it for kind of almost blending. And as I said before, I do want the flowers to be my main focus, so I'm not going to put too many highlights on this. And now I'm going to get just a little bit of this lighter green, get my small brush and use that for some tiny extra little highlights. Again, as I said, I'm not going to finish all of these perfectly, just a little bit here and there. I'll actually get a little bit of green through there as well. Just let it run a little bit. This is almost like a watercolor technique now rather than a water mixable pastel, but that's fine. They are very close, these materials. And remember, if you are using other materials, like for example you are painting your roses with oils, the end result will be very different, and the techniques that you would need to employ will be very different too. So don't try and follow this video. This is just for water mixable materials on black paper. Now I'm gonna pay more attention to these ones. Now I'm also going to use other colors like ochre and brown in this sort of a similar technique of picking up color with a brush. And going for some brown too. And I'm even going to go for a little bit of this sort of a magenta, pinky, whatever you want to call it, color, and add a little bit of that into the petal, into the leaves. How funny, I call petals leaves and leaves petals. Whenever you work with watercolor, you need to make sure that you use many different colors in your work, blending things in. It's not as important, I think, with water mixable pastels, but you can still do that, and I think to some level, when you do it to some level, it actually brings a lot to the work. But with watercolor you really need to do this. I'll do a tutorial for you guys at some stage with watercolor still life as well. Okay, and now I'm going to use black to bring in a little bit of shadow in some areas where I think they should be just a little bit darker than what I've got them at the moment. So just down here by the flower, and somewhat there. Also this is just way too bright here, so I'm just going to push it back. Oh, I forgot the little, that's what I forgot. I thought I needed to add something else. Yeah, these little leaves just there, just a little bit. You almost can't see it, but it is there. And I'm going to use some ochre to define them. When I was a student in Russia, we didn't have water mixable pastels, watercolor pencils. We only had watercolor, which is also really fun to work with. But it is so cool to just be able to do something else, you know, use a different material for a change. And now I'm going to grab this and soften this again, because I think it's just getting a bit too much attention. And then I think it's done. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you did. Press the notification bell and subscribe if you haven't done that so far, because I'll have more tutorials coming up. I hope you have a lovely day, and as always, thank you for painting with me.